At 0213, the black water in the Strait of Hormuz looked flat enough to fool a careless crew, but every sailor on the American boarding package knew better. A tanker lane sat less than 5 miles away, radar returns were crowding the screen, and 3 Iranian speedboats were already slicing across the transit corridor like they owned it. Their wakes crossed in hard white X's. Their bows rose and slammed. Green tracer arcs snapped over the water as warning shots from one of the boats punched wide of a Liberian-flagged chemical tanker trying to hold course. Off the tanker's port quarter, 2 Navy SEAL combatant craft were closing fast under radio silence because the laughing voices coming over bridge to bridge had made one thing clear. The Iranians thought the Americans were too boxed in, too cautious, and too late to stop them. The picture had formed in pieces over the previous 12 minutes. First came a distress burst from the tanker's master reporting armed small craft. Then the MH-60 feed showed 4 heat signatures on the lead boat, 3 on the second, and at least 5 on the third, all carrying long guns and cutting dangerously close to the tanker's hull. Fifth Fleet knew the pattern. Harassment could become seizure before sunrise. In that narrow strip of water, a few men in fiberglass boats could shake oil markets, spike insurance rates, and make every bridge crew in the Gulf wonder who controlled the lane. That was what people ashore missed. Hormuz is not just water on a map. It is a pressure point. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that choke point, and every armed approach carries weight far beyond the horizon. If Iranian crews could bully a merchant ship under the nose of U.S. naval forces, the incident would race from bridge logs to every capital watching the Gulf. 7 minutes of humiliation there could do more damage than 7 days of speeches. The speedboats knew the geometry favored them. They were small, fast, and hard to classify against crowded commercial traffic. Their hulls could leap over chop that forced larger ships into wider turns. The tanker could not maneuver hard without risking collision or grounding. The destroyer farther east had guns, missiles, and radar, but none of that helped if the fight collapsed to knife range around a civilian hull. One bad burst into a chemical carrier and the tactical win would become a regional disaster. That was why the SEALs had been launched. This was a precision problem. But the rules of engagement narrowed the clock even further. The Iranian boats had not yet fired into the bridge or visibly tried to board. They were threatening, hurting, and probing just beneath the line that would make a heavy response politically simple. The Americans had to identify hostile intent, protect the merchant crew, and do it without turning a standoff into a public bloodbath. The ideal end state was not a burning boat, it was control. The task group commander understood the danger immediately. If the Iranians got grappling ladders onto that tanker, even for a minute, the operation would become a hostage event. If one speedboat broke off and planted a limpet mine, the lane could close. If the tanker captain panicked and altered course across the separation scheme, half a dozen innocent ships could pile into the same crisis. So the order that came down the chain was brutally simple. Break the swarm, disable the lead movers, board everything that still floats, detain every armed man you can hold, time on target, now. The SEAL officer in the lead craft did not need the speech repeated. His team had trained for maritime interdiction in darkness, tight water, and mixed legal thresholds. Each operator knew his lane. One pair carried less lethal launchers and flex cuffs. Another pair carried carbines. The aft gunner manned a mounted machine gun because visible overmatch could stop a bad decision before it started. Their coxswain aimed not at the nearest hull, but at the water the Iranian lead boat would need in 30 seconds. The second American craft mirrored the move to cut off the flank. Overhead, the helicopter fed range and bearing updates. Then the first break came. One Iranian boat accelerated straight at the tanker's bow, trying to force a turn. Another drifted wide to the starboard side, likely setting up a cross-angle intimidation pass. The third stayed aft and slightly outside the classic support position, close enough to join, far enough to run. That was the tell. It was no random harassment. It was a coordinated maneuver. The lead SEAL coxswain shoved both throttles forward. Twin engines bit. The American craft slammed across the chop at more than 40 knots, bow high, then flattened as it cut inside the tanker's projected path. A loudhailer challenge went out in English first, then in rehearsed Farsi. Alter course immediately, cut engines, keep your hands visible. And the answer came back over open radio with laughter and a string of insults. That laughter lasted only a few seconds because the Americans had already moved to the next step. The helicopter dipped lower, bright white searchlight washing over the lead speedboat. Men on deck suddenly lost their darkness. Faces, rifles, fuel cans, and mooring hooks all flashed into view. At the same moment, the second SEAL craft surged across the trailing boat's escape lane and forced it into its own wake. The tanker kept steady at reduced speed, exactly as ordered, buying the Americans the one thing small boat fights always steal first: predictability. The lead Iranian driver still tried to punch through. He turned his wheel toward the narrow gap between the tanker's bow and the American intercept craft, gambling that the SEALs would blink rather than risk a collision. They did not blink. The coxswain cut hard, crossed the speedboat's nose at a brutal angle, and dropped a warning flare directly into the water ahead of it. The flash hit like a camera bomb in the dark. The Iranian boat veered instinctively. That half second of hesitation exposed its engine block to the helicopter crew, which had been waiting for a clean line away from the tanker's hull. A short controlled burst cracked from above, not into the men, into the outboards. Metal shattered, the lead boat threw spray, yawed, and lost power in a coughing cloud of smoke. Now the geometry collapsed on the other two. The aft support craft punched away at full throttle, trying to sprint east toward Iranian waters, but it had already given up the center. The trailing SEAL boat angled in and matched it, cutting inside the turn radius where speed meant nothing. One operator fired a less lethal impact round at the helmsman's console. Another painted the gunman with an infrared laser only he and the helicopter crew could see. The message was unmistakable: move that rifle and you will not finish the motion. The support craft lost nerve first. Two weapons hit the deck. The starboard boat made the worst choice. Its crew tried intimidation one last time, swinging close and throwing spray across the tanker's side while one man raised his weapon chest high. That was enough. Hostile intent was no longer arguable. The mounted gunner on the lead American craft sent a precise burst across the waterline and in front of the bow, forcing the driver to jerk away, while a SEAL beside him fired at the exposed outboard casing. The round chewed the engine mount, the motor kicked sideways and died. Momentum carried the boat broadside into the chop. Suddenly, the men who had been circling a tanker like hunters were just passengers in a dead hull under a helicopter beam. The 7-minute countdown that would later define the incident started there. At the moment, all three Iranian boats were dead in the water or trapped under American guns. That was when the mission changed from intercept to seizure. The SEAL officer did not waste a breath celebrating. Dead engines did not mean safe decks. Small boats can hide pistols, grenades, sat phones, detonators, and one final act of bravado. He split the boarding sequence by risk. First the disabled lead boat, because it had shown the strongest hostile maneuver. Then the starboard craft, because the crew looked less disciplined and more likely to panic. Last, the support boat, which already seemed halfway beaten. Boarding a low boat in night chop is ugly even in training. In a real intercept, it is controlled violence measured in inches. The first SEAL hooked the lead boat's rail and stepped across with his carbine tucked tight. Another followed, driving a suspect flat against the deck before his hands could disappear under a tarp. A third operator cleared the bow locker and found spare magazines, a hooked boarding ladder, and coil after coil of heavy line. Not fishermen, not curious patrolmen, a seizure package. The driver was zip-tied first. The man with the radio was second. The gunman who had laughed over the open channel tried one last protest in broken English, then saw 3 lasers settle onto his chest and chose silence instead. On the second boat, resistance dissolved faster. The driver froze with both palms out. One crewman started to rise, saw the helicopter overhead, and dropped back to his knees. Flex cuffs clicked in rapid sequence, wrists behind backs, heads down. The third boarding took longer only because one suspect had wedged a pistol under a seat frame before lifting his hands. A SEAL found it, held it up under the searchlight for the camera record, and bagged it. That mattered as much as the arrest itself. In the Gulf, proof is ammunition. By the time the lead officer called all detainees secured, 7 minutes had passed since the first engine kill. 12 Iranian personnel were handcuffed, searched, disarmed, and transferred under armed escort. No tanker crew had been injured. No American had been hit. No one had turned the strait into a fireball. The chemical tanker resumed transit with a U.S. escort riding shotgun until it cleared the danger area. Behind it, the disabled boats bobbed under tow like the wreckage of a bad calculation. Dawn made the scene look less dramatic and more serious. In daylight, investigators could see how close the crisis had come to becoming something larger. The seized gear included ladders, extra fuel, encrypted radios, and small magnetic devices that did not belong anywhere near a merchant hull in one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. Whether the mission had been a rehearsed intimidation drill, an attempted boarding, or preparation for sabotage, almost stopped mattering once the physical evidence was laid out. The intent had been coercion. The capability was real. The failure was complete. Back on the American net, the reporting stayed cold and precise. Bearings, weapons recovered, detainee count, condition of the tanker crew. But under that clipped language sat a different truth. Everyone involved knew how narrow the margin had been. A tanker full of volatile cargo had crossed one of the world's tightest maritime choke points with armed boats trying to bully it off script. One collision, one blind burst, one panicked turn, and the Gulf would have woken up to flames, drifting chemicals, and a diplomatic crisis no admiral could untangle with a morning press statement before markets even opened in Asia. And that failure carried a strategic sting. Iran's small boat doctrine depends on speed, confusion, and political hesitation. Fast inshore craft are cheap, deniable, and effective at creating headlines if the other side delays. They are built for cluttered water, where large warships look powerful but must act carefully. Yet the doctrine breaks down the moment a disciplined force strips away its advantages. Deny darkness, deny approach space, deny escape lanes, use helicopters to expose, use small craft to pin. Once the swarm loses motion, it loses most of its power. That is what made the incident more than a tactical success. It showed that the answer to harassment in confined water is not always bigger weapons and bigger platforms. Sometimes the answer is a smaller, faster, better drilled response that can operate inside the legal and physical limits of the fight. The SEALs did not win because they were louder. They won because they understood the timing better than the men taunting them. They read the contact geometry, recognized the support boat, protected the civilian hull, and collapsed 3 hostile options into one outcome: surrender. The laughing mattered too, not because it was insulting, but because it revealed the central misread. The Iranian crews believed caution meant weakness. In the Gulf, that is a dangerous assumption. The Americans had spent those first moments not hesitating, but shaping the field. They were measuring arcs of fire, tracking bearings, waiting for a clean shot at engines instead of men, and building a legal picture that would survive morning scrutiny. The speedboats mistook discipline for fear, and by the time they understood the difference, the cuffs were already coming out. For the merchant crews who cross Hormuz, that distinction is everything. They need to know that if armed boats rush them in the dark, someone can intervene without turning their deck into a battlefield. They need a navy that can think in tight spaces and boarding teams who can end a crisis at 20 yards, not just destroy targets at 20 miles. That night, the strait stayed open because a handful of men on small craft solved a problem that a destroyer alone could not. And somewhere between the radio mockery and the sunrise transfer, a lesson settled over the water. In confined seas, arrogance burns fuel fast, competence closes faster. Those Iranian speedboats came in laughing at U.S. Navy SEALs. 7 minutes later, they were handcuffed.